Speaker Foley and Senator Baker. If confirmed, I will try every day to live up to the standard they set in representing the United States and advancing our relationship with Japan. I am also grateful to Ambassador Tom Schiefer and especially to Ambassador John Roos and Susie Roos for their generous advice and wisdom. I would also like to acknowledge Ambassador Sasai from the Embassy of Japan, who is himself a distinguished diplomat and has been a steadfast friend to the United States. I can think of no greater honor than to represent my country abroad. I've spent my career working to make American history and ideals accessible to the widest possible audience, and in particular to younger generations.
President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be rescinded.
Without objection.
Mr. President, earlier this week, the Congressional Budget Office released its latest long-term outlook. And, of course, the CBO, as it's known around here, is the authoritative guide to all things involving the finances and the fiscal picture for the federal government. That long-term outlook offered us a sobering reminder that the federal government cannot defy the laws of fiscal gravity forever. In other words, as every American knows, every working family knows, your output can't exceed your input forever, or you can't spend more money than you have coming in. Unless you're the federal government, of course, but sooner or later, we'll have to reverse the trend of debt accumulation before it destroys our economy, and because our current path is simply unsustainable. And you know, the crazy thing about it is that everybody in Washington, particularly Congress, everybody knows that. And yet it seems like they're in a state of denial about what could very well happen to our country and to our future if we don't act. As I said, it's a very sobering message, and it's also very different from the message that President Obama has been delivering lately, who likes to talk about America's short-term budget deficit falling. Well, just to remind everybody, there's the debt and there's deficits. Deficits we measure on an annual basis. Debt is the cumulative shortfall between what comes in the front door and what goes out the back door. And that debt now is about $17 trillion. For these young people down here, that's about $52,000 each that you owe because my generation and other adults have not been responsible. And we have shoved off on the next generation the responsibilities that we ought to be meeting ourselves today. So here's the reality. Any short-term deficit reduction will be meaningless unless we adopt longer-term reforms, and that means where the federal government spends most of its money, which is in mandatory spending, and that's the spending that keeps Social Security and Medicare, among other programs, going. And we need to also bend the spending curve down so that we're spending less money as well. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that when we factor in the likely impact of rising debt levels, publicly held debt is on course to reach 108% of our gross domestic product in 2038. Gross domestic product, that's basically another way of saying the size of our entire economy. 108% of the size of our entire economy is their projection. And that's before we include money that the federal government effectively owes itself. So by 2038, and I realize that sounds like a long time. I remember when I was a kid growing up, I thought the year 2000 was going to be a long time away, but we now see that only in our rearview mirror. But by 2038, under current law, our net interest payments as a share of our economy would be 2.5 times greater than the 40-year average. Let me boil that down a little bit. When we borrow money because we're spending money we don't actually have, that adds to our annual deficit. But it also, over time, adds to our national debt. So we have to get somebody to buy that debt so we can continue to spend money we don't have. We can continue to spend borrowed money. Well, we have to pay interest to our creditors. In other words, they're going to expect a rate of return, as anybody would if you loan somebody money. Well, so when China loans us money, it's not cost-free. When they buy a huge portion of our national debt, it's not cost-free. And over time, we will see interest rates, which are really at historic lows because of the aggressive action of the Federal Reserve keeping interest rates low. As interest rates go back up, as they will, to historic norms, we're going to see a larger and larger share of what the federal government spends just merely to pay China and our other creditors to buy our debt, unless we take aggressive measures to begin to bring our debt load down. Now, the President and the Democrats frequently demand more spending on things like research and development. That's a good thing. Or infrastructure. That's a good thing. Yet they refuse to embrace the serious reforms that are necessary to enable us to do that. So here again, when the interest payments on the debt invariably will go up, they crowd out spending on other priorities like research and development, like infrastructure, like education, other things that should be among our national priorities. Well, the Congressional Budget Office projects that, again, by 2038, total spending on everything other than major health care programs, Social Security, and net interest payments would decline to 7% of our gross domestic product. And that's down from 11%, which is the average over the last 40 years. And that's the crowding out effect that I was mentioning a moment ago. So when you're spending more and more money on these other programs, it crowds out spending on other things necessary to keep our economy growing and to keep people employed. If we don't start reforming our biggest mandatory spending programs, again, that's Social Security and Medicare, in a responsible sort of way, it'll become much harder for the federal government to perform its most basic obligations. And it will leave these young people and others, like my daughters, who are in their early 30s, leave them holding the bag, not only with the debt that I mentioned a moment ago, but also with broken programs that are unsustainable, that will not be there for them when they turn 65 or when they get older. So, you know, it is a law of nature that you can't keep spending money that you don't have, and you can't keep racking up debt forever without any consequences. The only question is whether the reforms I'm talking about will be gradual, be phased in over time, or whether they'll be sudden and abrupt and disruptive. If we start now in a responsible way, these reforms can be gradual. You know, thank goodness when Social Security was passed, people didn't live to be 80 years old on average, and they weren't as productive as they are today. That's a good thing. Modern medicine and nutrition have made it possible for us to live longer on average and much more productively. But we need to make sure that we take into account through Medicare and Social Security the fact that people are living longer and more productively, and to make sure that our programs are modernized to keep up with those, to make sure they're available in the future, particularly among our most vulnerable citizens. But if we wait until America is on the verge of a debt crisis, the reforms will have to be abrupt. In other words, when the bottom drops out, a lot of people are going to be hurt, and it will be far more difficult to protect the most vulnerable among us from the harshest sort of cuts. So what I'm suggesting just to me makes sense, that wouldn't we prefer to be in control of a gradual reform of our mandatory spending programs that are phased in over years in ways that most Americans will not actually feel because it can be done gradually? Well, to me it makes sense to do that, as opposed to watching the bottom drop out or just simply kicking the can down the road. But you know what they say, if you kick the can down the road long enough, pretty soon you're going to run out of road. Well, let me again quote from the Congressional Budget Office. They said at some point, investors will begin to doubt the government's willingness or ability to pay U.S. debt obligations, making it more difficult or more expensive for the government to borrow money. Moreover, even before that point is reached, the high and rising amount of debt the CBO projects under the extended baseline would have significant negative consequences for both the economy and the federal budget. Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent for 2 additional minutes.
Without objection.
Those negative consequences would include less private investment, more federal spending on interest, which I've talked about briefly, less flexibility to address unexpected events, which you know always seem to occur, like 9/11 or a natural disaster, and more risk of a full-blown debt crisis. To the extent that President Obama and our friends across the aisle acknowledge our long-term debt problem, their main solution seems to be always the same. Let's raise taxes some more. Well, in fact, they're now trying to use tax reform, which we thought should be revenue neutral, as a vehicle for another $1 trillion tax increase. We're told that's a condition of even talking about reforming our tax code to make it flatter, simpler, and more growth-oriented. And that's even after the President and his allies have already raised taxes by $1.7 trillion. So there's never enough to feed the beast of the federal government here in Washington. It's insatiable. Meanwhile, to the extent the President acknowledges the need for Medicare reform, his proposals always involve more price controls, primarily on the providers. Yet price controls have not solved Medicare's fundamental cost problems, and they won't solve it in the future. What it's done is they said, well, we can save money on Medicare, we'll just whack the payments we make to doctors and hospitals. Well, I can tell you from talking to the hospitals in Texas and the doctors who would like to see Medicare patients, but they can no longer afford to do so, that it is limiting access to health care by just dealing with Medicare on this basis of price controls and whacking payments to providers. Amid the weakest economic recovery and the longest period of high unemployment since the Great Depression, the last thing we need is another massive tax increase that would discourage work, savings, and investment. We all know that we cannot simply tax our way back into fiscal stability, and we cannot spend our way back into economic prosperity. If the President would just merely accept those 2 realities, we might finally get the kind of long-term reforms and the real long-term spending cuts that might finally produce the economic recovery that America is desperately waiting for and desperately needs. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Pennsylvania.
Mr. President, I rise this morning to address the energy efficiency bill that we have been attempting to take up in this chamber, and in particular an amendment that I would like to offer to this bill. And I want to just strongly urge my colleagues, could we please get on this bill? I really wish we'd do some business here in the Senate. I think we're on our way to our 2nd consecutive week where we have not had a single vote on a single legislative matter, at least not that I can remember. And we've got important legislative issues to deal with. I happen to think this is one of them. There are many others, but this is just not acceptable that we go on and on without without addressing the challenges that we need to address for the sake of the people we represent, the American people. I want to talk about one small, particular, but important aspect of this. I have an amendment that I have filed, and I want to thank my co-sponsors, Senators Coburn, Flake, Risch, and Ayad, for joining me in this effort. It's an effort to repeal the renewable fuel standard. And I want to talk a little bit about why this is so important that we do this. First of all, the renewable fuel standard is an old law. It's on the books, and it requires, it's a federal government mandate, that we burn certain amounts, a certain volume of ethanol in our gasoline. That's the mandate. We've gotten to the point where this year, this mandate will require that over 40% of all the corn we grow in America is going to be turned into ethanol and burned in our gasoline tanks, from our gasoline tanks in our automobiles. We are literally burning our food. That's what we're doing on a very, very large scale. And the way this law works is it requires increases every year in the amount of ethanol that we are forced to burn through our gasoline tanks. The fact is, Mr. President, this policy is harmful to our environment. It is unambiguously raising food prices. It makes it more expensive to fill up at the gas pump. And it's really threatening good-paying jobs in Pennsylvania and in other states. It's time for this to go, and what my amendment would do would be completely repeal this renewable fuel standard, which is overdue. And I know there's broad support for peeling this back, and I would hope that there's a majority in this body that would support this amendment if we could only get onto it. So I do very much hope we will. Let me explain just how problematic this is. First of all, let's remember the history, right? The whole idea behind creating this renewable fuel standard, behind forcing people to take corn, convert it into ethanol, and burn it in their car engine, the idea was that this was somehow going to be good for the environment. That was the idea at the time that it passed. In fact, it is clear that this is bad for the environment. This is counterproductive just purely from an environmental point of view. The Environmental Working Group, for instance, put out a statement. They have said on the record, and I quote, "The rapid expansion of corn ethanol production has increased greenhouse gas emissions, worsened air and water pollution, and driven up the price of food and feed." This is the Environmental Working Group that came to that conclusion. It is widely acknowledged that using corn ethanol instead of gasoline actually creates more carbon dioxide emissions, the greenhouse gas emissions that many people are very concerned about. You have more of that when you burn ethanol than if you burned gasoline. In fact, the Clean Air Task Force estimates that carbon emissions from corn ethanol between 2015 and 2044 on the path that we're on now would exceed 1.4 billion tons, and that's 300 million tons more than if all of that instead were, if the energy were supplied by gasoline instead. So it's counterproductive from a carbon emission point of view. We have a chart here that quotes a conclusion from a study at Stanford University that indicates the harm that ethanol does directly to human health, right? Vehicles running on ethanol will generate higher concentrations of ozone, which is a harmful gas. Higher concentrations of ozone than those using gasoline, especially in the wintertime. And finally, in 2011, the National Academy of Sciences stated, and I quote, "Projected air quality effects from ethanol fuel would be more damaging to human health than those from gasoline use." Okay, so I understand there was a time when we didn't know these things, when we had a different impression about the health and the air quality implications of using ethanol. But we don't have that excuse anymore. It is now clear that using ethanol instead of gasoline is net harmful to the environment and harmful to human health. That's a pretty good reason to reconsider this all by itself. But there are more reasons. One is the fact that it's more expensive to produce ethanol than it is to produce gasoline. So not only is this harmful to our health, but it costs more to do it. The Wall Street Journal estimated that in 2014, The renewable fuel standard will increase the per gallon cost of gasoline by anywhere from 10 to 25 cents. That adds up. That could be over $300 a year on average for the average family. It's billions of dollars across our economy. That is a deadweight loss. No good thing comes out of that extra cost. It just reduces the standard of living of everybody who's forced to bear that cost. And then in addition to increasing fuel prices, it increases food prices, which stands to reason if you take 40% of all the corn that's produced in America and you burn it, well, there's that much less corn that's available for food. And corn is an incredibly basic and important source of food, both directly and indirectly. This phenomenon alone, the diversion of corn for ethanol production, is deemed by many scholars who've looked at this as costing maybe as much as a full percentage point a year for the average family. That's on the order of over $150 per year that we force people to pay in the form of higher food prices alone. Another example is the indirect way in which higher corn prices filter into the rest of the economy. The fact is, feed grain is typically half the cost of raising livestock, and corn is the dominant feed grain in America. The USDA's chief economist stated that the renewable fuel standard increases corn prices between 30 and 40%. And it got so bad, it got so absurd, that in 2012, Mr. President, there were farmers feeding their cattle candy because it was cheaper to buy candy than to buy corn. Now, how absurd is this? That a federal government policy is driving this kind of behavior. It makes no sense at all. Here's another fact about ethanol. Fact is, it's harmful to motors. It's harmful to engines. The reciprocating piston engines that we use in our vehicles and motorcycles and boat engines and others, they're designed to burn gasoline. They're not designed to burn ethanol. And the EPA has acknowledged this, that ethanol is harmful to these engines because ethanol is corrosive. There's more water gets dissolved in the ethanol. The EPA has acknowledged this. Unlike other fuel components, ethanol is corrosive. It's that water mixture that does damage to engines. The AAA has warned that raising ethanol content in fuel further, which is what current law has in store for us, it'll damage 95% of the cars on the road today. And then the last thing I would point out, Mr. President, is that this policy threatens good-paying jobs. There's no question. I visited a refinery in southeastern Pennsylvania, a refinery that employs hundreds of workers in good-paying jobs, providing the gasoline that we need to move our economy, to move our families, to get to and from work and to do all the things we need to do in life. Well, the fact is, their ability to be a viable, ongoing refinery is jeopardized. It's threatened by the renewable fuel standard. I want to read you a letter that I got from the Philadelphia AFL-CIO business manager, a gentleman named Pat Gillespie, whose concern is the job security of the workers he represents. And I'm going to quote from his letter to me. He says, "Our resurrected refinery in Traynor, Pennsylvania," that's right, it's resurrected. This is my aside. This was a refinery that was shuttered and in danger of never reopening, and it took an amazing effort by the stakeholders in this community to make this viable, and it is viable right now, and it's employing hundreds of workers in Delaware County. But the point that Mr. Gillespie makes is that our resurrected refinery in Traynor, Pennsylvania, once again needs your intercession. The impact of the dramatic spike in the cost of RIN credits. Now, the RIN credit is the system by which the EPA enforces compliance with these renewable fuel standards. It's too complicated to get into, but it is part of the counterproductive economics of this. So to get back to Mr. Gillespie's letter, the impact of the dramatic spike in the cost of the RIN credits from 4 cents to $1 per gallon will cause a tremendous depression in our refinery's bottom line in 2013. Of course, at the building trades, we need them to have economic vitality, to bring about the construction and maintenance projects that our members depend on. And the steelworkers, of course, need the economic vitality so they can maintain and expand their jobs with the refinery. We need your assistance, your help with this matter. Well, I want to provide the help that they need, that Pennsylvanians need, that we all need from this ill-conceived policy that clearly has no place in the United States anymore. The help is in the form of this amendment. This amendment solves the problem. It repeals this ill-conceived standard completely. It would go away. I know there's bipartisan support for this amendment. I have several colleagues who've co-sponsored this amendment. This is our opportunity to pass this amendment. As I've said, and let me just to recap, this is just bad policy on every possible front. The renewable fuel standards, the forcing us to burn so much of our corn in the form of ethanol is harmful to our environment. It's harmful to human health. It increases food prices. It increases fuel prices at the pump. It damages the engines that we rely on, and it jeopardizes jobs. What more arguments do we need to bring an end to this misguided program? We know this. We've known this for some time. Now is the time to act. So, Mr. President, I'm just urging my colleagues, let's get on the bill. Let's have amendments. Let's have lots of amendments. If we'd spent the last week mowing down amendments instead of arguing about them, we'd be done by now. We could have processed many dozens of amendments easily. And one of them could have been this one. Well, I don't think it's too late. We could still get on this bill. We could still do something that would be very, very sensible for our environment, for our economy, for consumers, for our health, for the sake of our jobs. Let's repeal the renewable fuel standards. Let's do it by adopting my amendment, and let's do that by getting on this bill. And Mr. President, I yield the floor. Mr. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from Oregon.
I would ask unanimous consent to vacate the quorum call.
Without objection. Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consider S. 1392, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 154, S1392, a bill to promote energy savings in residential buildings and industry and for other purposes.
Mr. President.
Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, I rise again to talk about the urgent need, as October 1st approaches, to vote on a no Washington exemption from Obamacare amendment or bill. Now, again, Mr. President, this need isn't of my creating. I wish it weren't here, but it is because of an illegal rule issued by the Obama administration to completely reverse the clear language on the subject in Obamacare. Mr. President, let me just back up and give the brief history. During the Obamacare debate, a proposal was made by many of us, led by Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, and the proposal was simple. He said every member of Congress, all congressional staff, should live under the most onerous provisions of Obamacare. Specifically, we should have to get our health care from the exchanges, where millions of Americans are going against their will, having lost, in many, many cases, the previous health care coverage from employers that they enjoyed. So Senator Grassley said that's what Washington should have to live with. And there was explicit, specific language put in Obamacare to that point for Congress. Said every member of Congress, all congressional staff have to go to the exchange. The intent behind this was crystal clear. As the senator said, quote, the more that Congress experiences the laws it passes, the better, close quote. And I agree with that. I agreed with it then. I agree with it now. Well, amazingly, that provision got in the final version of Obamacare. And then I guess it was a classic example, if you will, of what Nancy Pelosi said. We have to pass the law to figure out what's in it. Well, it did pass. Folks around Capitol Hill did figure out what's in it with regard to that section. And they said, oh, you know what? We have to go to the exchanges. We don't like that. And that's going to create out-of-pocket expense. We don't like that. And so immediately furious lobbying started, continued for some time, and sure enough, as a result of that, President Obama personally intervened. He was personally involved, and his administration issued a rule on this subject right as Congress safely had left town for the August recess. That rule said two things, basically. One, it said, this official congressional staff, we don't know who that is. So every member of Congress will get to decide what staff, if any, under their employment will have to go to the exchange. Well, Mr. President, that's ridiculous. I think that's ludicrous on its face. That's not what the statute says at all. It says all official congressional staff. And every member of Congress shouldn't be able to decide differently, member by member, whether anyone at all on their staff has to go to the exchange. But the second part of this illegal rule is even more interesting. It said whoever does go to the exchange in terms of members and staff gets to take their very, very generous taxpayer-funded subsidy from the Federal Employee Health Benefit Plan with them. Now, the Obamacare statute doesn't say that at all, and in fact, a different part of the Obamacare statute says exactly the opposite. It's about employees in general who go to the exchange, and it says when an employee goes to the exchange, he or she loses any previous employer-provided subsidy. That's Section 1512. That's explicit in the Obamacare statute. So this special rule for Washington is illegal, flat out illegal and contrary to the statute, in my opinion. But it goes into effect October 1st, and that's why my colleagues and I who support the no Washington exemption language had to take action, had to fight for a vote now. We need this debate and vote now before October 1st. That's what it's all about, Mr. President. As I said, my distinguished colleague from Iowa who authored this language couldn't have been more clear. Quote, the more that Congress experiences the laws it passes, the better, close quote. Also, employment lawyers who have looked at the statute agree with me that there's no big subsidy that we should be able to take with us to the exchange. For instance, David Ermer, a lawyer who's represented insurers in the federal employee program for 30 years said, quote, "I don't think members of Congress and their staff can get funds for coverage in the exchanges under the existing law," close quote. That was in the New York Times. Many other employment lawyers have said the same because it's crystal clear from the statute. As National Review Online reported, quote, "Most employment lawyers interpreted that to mean that the taxpayer federal health insurance subsidies dispensed to those on Congress's payroll, which now range from $5,000 to $11,000 a year, would have to end," close quote. Yes, that is the clear language and the clear legislative history of the statute. And yet, all this hocus pocus to do exactly the opposite, contrary to the law. As the Heritage Foundation said, quote, "Obama's action to benefit the political class is the latest example of this administration doing whatever it wants, regardless of whether it has the authority to do so. The Office of Personnel Management overstepped its authority when it carried out the President's request to exempt Congress from the requirements of the health care law. Changing laws is the responsibility of the legislative branch, not the executive branch," close quote. And also, the Heritage Foundation also said, quote, "Washington's political class and allied big special interest lobbyists are responsible. And until this bad law is fully repealed, the President's team and Congress should submit fully to its multiple and costly requirements, just like everyone else," close quote. National Review Online has echoed the same, and they're right. Quote, "Under behind-the-scenes pressure from members of Congress in both parties, President Obama used the quiet of the August recess to personally order the Office of Personnel Management, which supervises federal employment issues, to interpret the law so as to retain the generous congressional benefits," close quote. And the Wall Street Journal opined, quote, "If Republicans want to show that they stand for something, this is it. If they really are willing to do whatever it takes to oppose this law, there would be no more meaningful way to prove it," close quote. So, Mr. President, this is why we're here at this moment, and this is why it is so important and necessary to have this debate and this vote now. Now, Mr. President, I'm very happy that at least some of my colleagues have properly recognized that, and that includes the distinguished majority floor manager of this bill, and have agreed in principle to this vote. The distinguished majority leader, Senator Reid, has agreed in principle to this vote. But it's interesting that, at least in his case, although we have some agreement in principle, we have no vote. And quite frankly, I'm not surprised. You know, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. If you agree to a vote, then you got to have a vote. And so we need to have a vote. We need to have a vote by October 1st, and I'm going to keep fighting for a vote. That's basic fairness to deal with this illegal rule. Again, the timing of this is here and now, and that's not of my doing. I didn't favor the illegal rule that makes the issue come before us. I didn't favor the October 1st deadline. That should never have happened at all. But it is before us, and that deadline is before us because of the illegal rule from the Obama administration. And so that's why we need a vote. We need a vote before October 1st. Now, as I said, the distinguished majority leader says he'll permit a vote. He says that in theory, but it doesn't happen in practice. So again, we wait and wait and wait and demand a vote. Doesn't have to be on this bill, and so I will continue to come back. I will file this amendment with regard to the CR. That's a perfect place to have this debate and vote. Or we can do it as a standalone bill, and we can do that easily next week before October 1st. We can do it without disrupting any other floor business, without delaying any other action with regard to the CR or anything else. And so, Mr. President, in that spirit, let me ask for unanimous consent in that regard, and I would ask unanimous consent that on Wednesday, September 25th, 2013 at 10 a.m., the Senate discharge the Senate Committee on Finance from consideration of my bill, the No Exemption for Washington from Obamacare Act, proceed immediately to consideration of that bill, S. 1497, that without any intervening motions or debate, the Senate proceed with 60 minutes of debate on the bill, evenly divided and controlled by the Majority Leader and myself, that the bill not be subject to any amendments, points of order, or motions to commit, and that after debate has expired, the bill be engrossed for third reading, read a third time, and the Senate immediately on passage, subject to a 60 affirmative vote threshold, a vote on passage, and that the motion to reconsider be made and laid upon the table following that vote.
Is there objection?
I object.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President, I understand that the floor leader is doing that for the Majority Leader, and I think that's very, very unfortunate. If the distinguished Majority Leader agrees to a vote in principle, we need a vote in reality. I said at the time when he agreed to it in principle that that's interesting, but I didn't think it would happen in reality, and sure enough, this week it happened. That's correct. It has not happened. So, you know, I think the Majority Leader, quite frankly, is very concerned about this vote. That's why he and others actually relied on threats and intimidation to try to avoid this vote. That didn't work. It's not going to work. I'm coming back with this amendment. I'm coming back with this bill. He's agreed to a vote in principle, so let's have a vote. And clearly, not from my doing, but because of the illegal Obama administration rule, that vote is timely now. That vote has to reasonably happen before October 1st, which is why I propose that unanimous consent. That is a way to have the vote, which the Majority Leader agreed to in principle, without disrupting any other business on the Senate floor. It would literally take 60 minutes of debate and a 15-minute vote. So I'm sorry that was not accepted by the Majority Leader, but needless to say, I'll be back with my bill, with my amendment. The American people deserve a vote because however it comes out, the American people should be able to know what senators will stand through that vote with Washington and what senators will stand with America. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President, before he leaves the floor, let me just say to the senator from Louisiana, I want to talk a little bit about exactly this question of reality and how we could address the Senate's business and address the senator's issue from Louisiana as well, not in principle, but with an actual vote. Because the reality is, Mr. President, there could have been already a vote on the amendment offered by the senator from Louisiana, and I'll describe exactly why that hadn't taken place. But it could have, and in my view, should have already taken place, and it shouldn't have been about principles. It should have been about the reality of the vote that the senator from Louisiana is talking about. So here we are, and of course it's hard for the public to figure out exactly how the Senate works. There's a new senator from Hawaii, and he's a student of this. But we have a bipartisan energy efficiency bill on the floor of the Senate now. As far as I'm concerned, and I describe it this way, this is the platonic ideal of what bipartisan consensus legislation ought to be all about. There's an extraordinary coalition built in favor of this group, the Business Roundtable, the National Association of Manufacturers, the Chamber of Commerce, with some of the country's leading public interest organizations that favor energy efficiency. And they're doing it for a reason. This is going to increase American productivity. We're going to save money because we aren't going to waste so much energy. And this is going to create good-paying jobs in a variety of new fields and technologies that are going to be good for people in our country. And My view is we should have already finished this debate with relevant amendments, and relevant amendments offered by both sides. And in fact, when we started the debate, for the first 4 or 5 hours, there was a good bipartisan amendment offered almost hourly. And we've got them all stacked up like, planes, hovering, over an airport. Now, at that point, conservatives indicated that there were 2 areas that they felt strongly about getting a vote on. Again, not talking about principles here. We're talking about the reality of a vote, and a vote that could have already taken place. One of them was on the amendment offered by the senator from Louisiana. I happen to disagree with the amendment strongly, but in all of the discussions, I said it seems appropriate that there be a vote on that amendment and on another amendment, which I disagree with, involving the Keystone Pipeline. And at that point, a very clear statement was made by the leadership, here, that if we're talking about the energy efficiency bill and these 2 votes, not principles, but realities of having those 2 votes, a vote on the Vitter Amendment and a vote on the Keystone Pipeline, and then we had relevant amendments, amendments that relate to energy efficiency, we would be able to complete this bill. And I'm of the view, since we started it last week, Mr. President, we would already have been done by now. What has happened after that message was communicated by the leadership on this side of the aisle, we have seen the response to that, in response to saying, well, vote on the amendment offered by the senator from Louisiana, we will vote on the proposal offered by Senator Hoeven from North Dakota. We'll have a procedural agreement to vote on other relevant amendments. We had scores and scores of other amendments offered to this bill that were clearly not related to energy efficiency. So I would say to the senator from Louisiana, the reality, not kind of rhetoric from the Senate or principles, the reality of why there has not been a recorded vote up or down. By the way, this is a vote that would have met the senator's principles that he wanted the vote before October 1st. There would have been that up or down vote on the amendment offered by the senator from Louisiana already. It would have been done in accord with the senator from Louisiana's wishes before October 1st. And what has been the sole hurdle in terms of securing that has been the scores of amendments that have been offered, primarily, really exclusively, from colleagues on the other side of the aisle who want to deal with other energy issues. Now, I just want to make one other comment with respect to this. Senator Murkowski and I, because we have worked in a bipartisan way since we were given the opportunity to lead the Energy and Natural Resources Committee at the beginning of this year, and we're honored to have the senator from Hawaii on the committee. We have said that our sole focus is going to be to try to find common ground on a host of energy issues that have been backed up, many of which colleagues on the other side of the aisle feel very strongly about. I would highlight, for example, nuclear waste legislation, where there has been no progress for years and years, and now Senator Murkowski and I, with Senator Feinstein and Senator Alexander, have a bipartisan bill that we think would allow us to finally get on top of a critical issue. I feel very strongly, and I know the senator from Louisiana cares a great deal about this, looking at ways to tap the potential of natural gas, which is 50% cleaner than the other fossil fuels. And so I've been working with industry and environmental leaders on what I call a win-win solution, where we could build more pipelines that the senator from Louisiana knows are important for the infrastructure of the natural gas business, And we would say in the future we're going to make them better pipelines, pipelines that don't leak so much methane. So it'll be good for consumers, it'll be good for the planet, and it will be good for industry. So we're interested in going on to those kinds of issues, nuclear waste issues, natural gas issues, offshore energy issues, again, important to the senator from, Louisiana, but it's pretty hard to get senators to focus on those kinds of issues if you can't move a piece of legislation like this energy, efficiency bill, which has really an unprecedented coalition behind it and has so many obvious benefits without mandates, without a one-size-fits-all strategy run from Washington. So I wanted to set the record straight in particular on this point. The senator from Louisiana and I are going to continue our discussions, and we always, have. But I especially want to emphasize, since my colleague from Louisiana has been talking about whether people say you can vote in principle but you don't vote in reality, the reality is we could have had a vote, Mr. President, already on the amendment offered by the senator from Louisiana before the October 1 date that he said he felt strongly about if colleagues on his side had not insisted on all of these other amendments not related to energy efficiency. And by the way, I've made it clear to them, coming from a state that doesn't produce, fossil fuels, I was willing to work with them, particularly in areas like I've just described, in tapping the potential of natural gas. So the reality is, A, there could have been a recorded vote, up or down, on the amendment offered by the senator from Louisiana already before October 1st, and I just hope he and others will continue to work with the bipartisan leadership so that we can quickly get a finite list of additional amendments, additional relevant amendments that would be offered after the senator from Louisiana gets his vote, after there's a vote from on the amendment offered by the senator from North Dakota. Those, Mr. President, are the realities of what has happened over the last week, and I yield the floor.
Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, let me just say that I appreciate the comments of the distinguished majority floor leader, and I accept them, and I know that they are sincere in terms of his actions and in terms of his involvement. My point, of course, was not about him. My point is, I don't think it was an accident that we never got to yes in practice. I don't think that was an accident at all. I don't think it was an accident from the point of view of the majority leader. I don't think it was an accident from others' point of view. And if you really want a clear glimpse into their true approach, you just have to look at the amendments that they floated last week, which literally were about threats, intimidation, and bribery. So that's a pretty clear window on where they're coming from, certainly not on where the distinguished floor leader is coming from. But let me just close by saying there's one more point of reality that I would underscore, and that's this. In the U.S. Senate, there's one member who can virtually guarantee that a vote happens, and that's the majority leader. So he's promised an up or down vote on this before October 1st in theory. He has the power to clearly make that happen one way or the other in practice. So we'll just see if he does. Simple as that. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
President,
Senator from Oregon.
I have 8 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session in the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I would note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the...
Mr. Alexander. Senators are debating an energy efficiency bill today, encouraging business development by helping manufacturers implement energy-efficient technologies for their businesses. Earlier, we heard Senator David Vitter of Louisiana come to the floor with his amendment that would remove federal health care subsidies for members of Congress and their staff. Majority Leader Harry Reid has opposed this amendment as it is not related to the subject of the bill. More debate on energy efficiency to come. Very quickly, the Associated Press is reporting that President Obama has threatened to veto House Republicans' temporary government funding bill since it contains language that would remove funding for the nation's health care law. Temporary funding for the government runs out on October 1st. Well, former First Daughter Caroline Kennedy testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to be the next U.S. ambassador to Japan. She reportedly said during her remarks that she would be humbled to carry forward her father's legacy if confirmed. She has finished her testimony. You can see it on our website at cspan.org. Testifying now is Ann Patterson to be Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs.
Co-sponsored by Senator Corker and I and other members of the committee, the Chris Stevens, Sean Smith, Tyrone Woods, and Glenn Doherty Embassy Security, Threat Mitigation, and Personnel Protection Act. You provided us with insights and benefits of many years in diplomatic security, first as a special agent in the Foreign Service, serving in Tunisia, Senegal, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. You later served in the Secretary of State Security Detail and Technical Security Operations, as Chief of the Division for Worldwide, Local Guard, and Residential Security Programs, and as a Senior Regional Security Officer at our Embassy in Tel Aviv. And now you're returning, coming out of retirement, to be considered for Assistant Secretary of State for Diplomatic Security at a time when we sorely need your experience and expertise. Let me conclude by saying I've said in the past and will say again, lessons we've learned from the tragedies in Nairobi, Dar es Salaam, and Benghazi are emblematic of a broader issue we will increasingly face in the 21st century. It will require our full, unequivocal, unwavering commitment to fully protect our embassies and those who serve this nation abroad, and that will be your charge as Assistant Secretary, to help strike the proper balance between sealing off vulnerabilities in high-threat areas and continuing to conduct vigorous and effective diplomacy that serves the national interest. The fact is we can never have absolute security in an increasingly dangerous world, but security alone is not our objective. At the end of the day, we need to address both the construction of new embassies that meet security needs, and we need to do what we can to secure existing high-risk posts where we need our people to represent our interests and where new construction is not an option. That's what Senator Corker and my embassy security bill seeks to do, and my hope is that we can look forward to the legislative process soon to achieve that. So we look forward to hearing from you, Mr. Starr, about the progress we've made, what other challenges we may have, and how do we pursue it. And again, thank you both for your years of service. I know Senator Corker had some original comments. I don't know if there's any you wish to pursue. And with that, Ambassador Patterson will welcome your statement. Both of your statements will be fully included in the record without objection, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Corker, members of the committee. It's an honor to appear before you today as the President's nominee for Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs. Mr. Chairman, I would like to introduce, if I could, my husband David and my older son Edward and my daughter-in-law Min. Mr. Chairman, I have prepared a longer statement for the committee, which I submitted for the record. I am grateful for the confidence shown by President Obama in nominating me for this position. If confirmed, I pledge to work with you to advance U.S. interests across an important and complex region that is facing historic upheaval. Mr. Chairman, the changes taking place across the region carry the promise of a more democratic political order that will benefit the region and the United States in the long term. However, the region will remain volatile and often violent for some time to come. The challenges we face are complex, but our extensive security, economic, and humanitarian interests demand our continued engagement. The region has changed in the past few years, and there is no going back. If confirmed, my top priority will be to protect our country and our allies. Doing so will require a vigorous effort to identify and disable serious chemical weapons. It will mean continuing to prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, and we must continue to combat terrorism and confront violent extremism across the region. Secondly, we will continue to promote sustainable democratic transitions. Let me stress again how hard this is going to be. The results of elections may not be to our liking, and transitions are often plagued by false starts and reverses. We will continue our efforts to promote democracy and universal rights, and we will stand up for the rights of women, Christians, and other minorities. Third, we need to support governments and the private sector to create economic opportunities and jobs. Many countries in the region need to fight corruption and cut subsidies to spur investment and growth. Our global economic leadership and our assistance programs both can play a role. And we must press for open business and trade environments so American businesses have fair access to growing markets. And fourth, Mr. Chairman, mindful that our country has lost 6,757 men and women in Iraq and Afghanistan, I would focus on coping with the enormous sacrifices that our colleagues in the State Department, in the intelligence community, and other civilian agencies are making, supporting these professionals and their families as we continue to ask more of them. People working in this region have been deeply and disproportionately affected by evacuations, lengthy separations from families, and the sheer workload associated with living and working on the critical front lines of American diplomacy. Mr. Chairman, protecting our country requires us to practice diplomacy in dangerous places. Our people understand this. Accepting calculated risks is part of what it means to be an American diplomat today. Our Bureau will work closely together with our ambassadors, with Mr. Starr of Confirmed, and our diplomatic security colleagues, and with all other elements of government to protect Americans overseas. I understand fully the responsibilities arising from the attack on our mission in Benghazi that resulted in the murders of 4 of our colleagues.